Hi, welcome to Live EMEA session series. My name is Magdalena Przelaskowska, and I'm the Program Manager at Google for Startups team. On a daily basis, I work with founders from Central and Eastern Europe. And during these challenging times, I saw that founders need support in up-leveling leadership skills. Not only you need to make sure that the business will survive, but also you need to be a leader that is the backbone of the entire team. Your teams have to and will rely on you. They watch what you say and how you say it, what you do and how you do it and how you react. More so even subconsciously in these challenging times. This is why we organized this inspirational session with Punit that will solely focus on this and nothing else. I couldn't imagine to do it without anybody else than Punit. His experience, knowledge, and thoughts have already inspired dozens of my startups. Before coaching founders, Punit worked many years at Google, where he mentored leaders to make sure that they progress to be best in class. So before we jump into the session, please check in, and it's very important if you would like to receive the follow-up emails from us. Also, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can post comments and questions in the comments box. If you're watching us on the website, you can click on the title of the video and it will lead you to YouTube. We will address those questions every 20 minutes. So, without further ado, over to you, Punit.
Thank you so much, Magda, and thank you to the Google for Startups team. So, welcome everyone. We're going to do some shared insights. I've probably coached about 10,000 leaders in my journey and wanted to share what we've learned from them. So there will be Q&A, so feel free to keep asking questions. So to get started, we're talking about managing through uncertainties. And when I think about that concept of what is uncertain and what is certain, one of the first questions I'm asking leaders is, what are you actually certain about today? And what were you actually certain about before COVID? And likewise, what are you uncertain about today and what were you uncertain about before? So we actually pull those two lists together. If we pull a list of what am I certain about versus what am I uncertain about, and actually think about how has it changed over the period of the virus. So most people actually say not much. Were we actually certain our startup would be successful? Were we actually uncertain the direction of the company? So one way of managing through the uncertainties and certainties is to understand the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. And maybe most of us have actually experienced some kind of loss. Maybe there's been some kind of separation or sadness or someone that we've actually personally lost. And the 5 stages talk about going through the cycle. It's about going through denial to anger, to bargaining, to depression and acceptance. So maybe some of you initially when the virus got public were in denial that this isn't happening. This won't happen to us in Europe. It's a thing in a different continent. And maybe it moves through anger to bargaining to some kind of sadness and depression and to acceptance. That's a normal cycle that we've all been through before in some form or fashion. What's different with this era is it's not just one cycle, there's a lot of rapid cycling. So we might feel like we were out of it a month ago and we're back into a new cycle. And then we might think we're out of it today and we might be entering a new cycle. So knowing that the cycles are rapid, I want to suggest that maybe there's a way out. Maybe there's a way to break out of the cycle. So maybe that 6th idea is actually finding new meaning. How do you break out of your cycle of the grief, of the loss, and actually find a new meaning? So that's some of the things we're going to focus on today. So when we look at this image, I'm often told this one image, this black and white image, represents loneliness, represents isolation. represents the journey of a founder, being alone and isolated. But maybe there's actually some positive when we look at this image. Maybe the individual is enjoying private reflection time. Maybe it's a sacred moment, a break in the day when he or she could sit down and think about what matters most to them. So even one simple image, whether it's black and white, can actually have different meanings. So an image of a town where I grew up can represent speed, can represent empire, can represent power. But that one city, even though this image represents that, wasn't always that way. Last week, we celebrated the end of a war. And so this city was destroyed by that war, but yet people the next day woke up and found new meaning in what their job was, their duty or their obligation. And others found new meaning in retaining a ritual and retaining a custom of just carrying on. And this actually represents community. In that same war, people gathered together on a Christmas day, not knowing that that so-called crisis above them would continue for a few more years. So if I display other cities, they too had their crisis. They too had their empires and their falls. Even most recently, when we look at this city from a different angle, it had its own crisis, right? And so what's interesting is, of all the cities I've shown, they've somehow survived. All those cities have somehow survived their own crisis. So if I take it a little narrow and I think about companies, some of these companies were the best in their industry. Some of these companies were the biggest and the best in their industries, where people dreamed of working for them. They too went through their own crisis. They too went through their own crisis and yet did not survive. Likewise, some of these brands that I grew up with, which represented my first computer, my first printer, my first other search engine, these companies too have working through their own crisis and may not survive. So why is it that cities survive a crisis and companies don't? How is it that for thousands of years, cities have survived a crisis and yet companies don't? And there's two words that come to mind for me. One is adaptability. Cities are able to adapt. And the second is leadership. Companies often lack leadership. So I want everyone to think of this as really easy. Leadership is really easy. It's just about adjusting. So as we're going through the rest of the slides, think about what one thing can you do as a leader to adjust. Some of those leaders that aren't able to adjust fall into the trap of over-managing. Right? Crises are known to be over-managed and under-led. So again, as you're going through the slides, think about how can you be a better leader and finding ways to adjust. So to start that leadership journey, let's think about leaders that you admire, whether they're living or dead, whether they're in business or politics, whether they're in sports or entertainment, whether they're somebody famous or not. What are the qualities that you admire in leaders? And as you're pulling the list together in your mind, there's actually no right or wrong. You get to choose what the qualities are that you admire in leaders. Now, if you have that list, and if that list is at least 2 or 3 qualities, the next question is, so what type of leader do you want to be? You can take those 2 or 3 qualities from the previous slide and inherit those, because if somebody else had them, then you have a shot of replicating that. But what else can you add? What type of leader do you want to be? And there's a layer below that. Before we actually get deep into answering what type of leader you want to be, to manage a crisis, to build a company, there's another more important fundamental question to ask. And that is, what type of human do you want to be? That simple symbol in the middle of DNA signifies that we as humans are 99.6% the same. So yes, there's a part that's different, but there's a lot of us as humans that are the same. So you get to actually work through different symbols and think about what makes you you. So this ancient symbol of the sun represents energy, represents life and light. So do you know what gives you energy? Do you know what gives you light and life? How can you wake up every day making sure you're giving yourself enough love, light, and life? There's also a symbol at the other end, which is the anchor. And the anchor grounds us. It keeps us calm and it keeps us centered. So likewise, do you know what helps you get centered, get calm, get grounded? Once you know those, it's all about aligning those to who you are. It's all about making sure your sun and your anchor help you go round and round and live the life that you want. So if we don't do that, if we don't take care of ourselves and our needs, it leads to stress. And I'm going to guess there's a lot of heads nodding in agreement that people have experienced stress. Maybe more right now. Hopefully it goes away. But for all of those that are familiar with stress, underneath stress is a whole world of emotions. And underneath that are a whole world of thoughts. In fact, we probably have about 80,000 thoughts on average per day. Mine are mostly repetitive thoughts, and I've been told mine are mostly useless thoughts. But still, there's a lot of thoughts being processed. And those thoughts attach to an emotion, and an emotion for a long period leads to stress, which is visible. So we want to find ways to manage our thoughts and our emotions so we can handle our stress as humans first. So as Magda mentioned, I coach a lot of founders in different parts of the world. And this is what I'm seeing that's happened since the outbreak of the virus. So of all the startups I'm coaching, 40% are in a state of failure, 50% are paralyzed or stuck, and 10% are adapting and innovating. The group I'm most concerned about is the middle. The group I worry about the most are those that are paralyzed and stuck. I know that the ones that are failing or failed will demonstrate their entrepreneurial spirit and bounce back and show resiliency. They'll find a new way. I also know that those that are in the 10% of innovating and adapting, they're actually loving finding new ways to build a business, new ways to work with people, new ways to contribute to an industry or a world. And so that adapting is similar to the adjusting we talked about earlier. right? So if you don't like the word adjusting, trust Darwin, the older guy with a bigger beard, about those that adapt will survive. So again, as leaders, look for ways to adjust and look for ways to adapt. So this crisis feels very different to most of the crises I've lived through. This one is different because there's a high level of uncertainty. We just don't know. This is so unfamiliar that there is a very high level of uncertainty. This is also different because there's a lack of facts, and those facts are ever changing. And those facts, even if they're coming from the highest ranks in governments, aren't necessarily trustworthy. The third is we've been paralyzed as observers. And as founders and entrepreneurs, we love to solve problems. And yet, this is a problem that we can't yet solve. We're paralyzed. Fourthly, this isn't just happening in a corner of the world. This is happening in the entire world, right? Everyone is affected, so it makes us feel different. But this also feels different because an opportunity to evolve leadership. That's where I'm spending my time, is trying to understand how can we evolve leadership. So as a species, we have evolved. We've always been evolving. And maybe there's certain markers when we could first stand up straight was an evolution, or when we could actually hold something and throw something was another evolution, right? So think of this as just a moment in all of our existence where we are just evolving and we're part of that evolution. So going back to that original image, if we layer on what looks like a cage, looks like a trap, looks like we're all contained in a limited amount of space. Now that's either a problem or an opportunity, right? So as an opportunity, we could say, because I'm not able to move around, because I'm not able to transition from home to work, or from work to friends, or from friends to sports or the gym, or out or back home, or even an office from meeting room to meeting room, because I've lost the ability to transition, I may have actually gained the time to reflect more as I transition. Because I'm not rushing from meeting to meeting, from place to place, I've actually gained time. Right? The second thing is, because we're actually stuck in one place and we're always on a Google Hangouts or some other kind of video conferencing tool, our ability to communicate with people has been reduced in person, but maybe it's been expanded because we're reaching out to people that matter most to us. We're actually having more meaningful conversations. We're making more effort to log in and to connect with those we want to connect with. So we're going to be coming up to some Q&A. And so if you want to keep asking questions, please do. And the Google for Startups team will sift through those and start asking questions. But after that, we're going to go through 10 tips of how you can, as leaders, start thinking about adapting.
Thank you, Punit, for that first part. We have a very international crowd watching us, but no questions so far. So I actually have a question for you. You were mentioning the grid cycle, and I think it will be interesting for all of us to know what are the ways of breaking out of that grid cycle.
Yeah, that's a great question, Magda. So I think step one is awareness. And by awareness, I mean, know where you are in that grief cycle and actually be courageous enough in labeling The second step I would say is to think about what one thing you can do to move to the next phase. It doesn't have to be a complete project or exercise to move out, but it just has to be one thing at a time. And the third step I would say is, beyond actually labeling or having action towards the next thing, is just having some kind of faith and belief that because you have managed these cycles before, you will manage this one too.
And since we have a lot of founders watching us, what are the common qualities of a startup leader?
So if I was to generalize a couple of things that great startup leaders have is, I think number one is curiosity. Like the founders that are deeply curious, not necessarily cynical or skeptical, but just curious, find ways to build things, find ways to connect with others on their teams, find ways to see new ideas, find ways to find new ways of living and doing stuff. So I would say is number one is curiosity. Number two is, and we'll talk about this a little later, is actually the concept of love, and not necessarily in a romantic sense, but just a love for life, an enthusiasm, a passion, a love to solve, a love to work with people, a love to bring a solution out into the world. So if we just had enough of those two, curiosity and love, it really helps a lot of founders progress. And I think those are two great starting points.
Thank you. I think I would also add resourcefulness, especially now during those challenging times.
Yeah, it's a great one.
So maybe last question. What are those leaders doing to adapt?
Great question. So maybe that can lead us on to the 10 tips. So I'll continue with the 10 tips because that picks on some of the things that they are doing.
If you don't mind, we actually have one question from our viewers, which is actually in the same topic. So Justin is asking, as the world goes virtual, do you think adapting will be the same across regions, or will adaption still be dependent on local norms?
Yeah, so Justin, that's a great question. I think there will be a core set of adaptations that happen globally, and like with anything, there will be regionalized or localized versions as well. And even within those regions, it will differ on your own personality and your own culture, your own character, your own style. So adaptation is happening at multiple levels: the global, the regional, the local, and even the personal.
Thank you. No more questions. So we wait for additional ones for the next Q&A.
Yeah, and please do write questions, because what we want this to be is an opportunity for you to get your own question answered. We can talk a lot about general theories on slides, but it works better when it's actually relevant to your world.
We do have one that just popped up from Monica. You talk about any examples of startups, companies which are great at adapting to these circumstances. So maybe based on your experience with whom you are working, if you have any examples, and if you can share those examples of how they are.
Yeah, so adaptation can happen in so many different ways. So just this morning, Twitter announced that one way of adapting is telling some employees that you will never have to come back to an office if you don't want to. You can actually work from home for the rest of your life if that's what you want. So think about the implications of that adaptation, which is, one, a company like Twitter is saying, we might not need all this office space. We might actually shrink the office space And we may actually realize culturally that extroverts that want to leave the house are coming into the office, but introverts that prefer the solitude and the privacy will stay at home. Or those with families will stay at home, or those that want to escape their families will come to work. So we're actually adapting to do good, but continuous adaptation needs to happen because we might end up having two different types of cultures of those that choose to work at home and those who choose to come into the office. So it's about making an adaptation and continuously thinking about what else can I adapt for that thing. So we'll go into some examples a little later. So I'll just start talking about some of the tips. And what I want to request is, while there's 10 tips, I don't want you to have to think about memorizing or implementing all 10. Just think of one that works for you. So the first tip is to take your time. And a lot of people get shocked when we say take your time, because in their mind, they think, wait, I have less time. I don't have time to take my time. I have too much to do. And the response is, if we actually take our time, if we actually take the pressure off, we can likely see new solutions, find new ways to be creative, right? We can actually get to a better outcome. Most of us, after a certain amount of pressure, can't function, right? That leads to stress. So if we think about where does creativity come from, most people say it's, well, I got that idea when I was in the shower. I got that idea when I was out on a walk. I got that idea when I was washing the dishes, right? So it's actually not time bound, right? I can't simply say, well, take longer showers or take longer walks or take more time doing dishes. But if you actually allow yourself permission to take the pressure off, to take your time and create a space for creativity to flow. So number one is take your time. Number two is to accept change. So similar to Magda's question about how do we break out of the grief cycle, step one is to accept where you are. And so this change is happening, right? Change has always been happening. And as we resist it, it gets harder and harder. It creates more friction and tension. By accepting it, or at least allowing it to be. And here's a way of thinking about that. So there's a tool that's used by execs, and it's called going to the balcony. And by going to the balconies, they're taking a moment out. They're taking a break out. And in that break at the balcony, they're pausing. They're just stopping and pausing. And that simple pause, what it's doing is those 80,000 thoughts that are going on in our mind, those emotions that are bubbling and surfacing, that stress that's appearing, we're allowing it to pause. We're just gently allowing it to pause. And from that pause, we can breathe. So we're actually breathing anyway. We're actually breathing hopefully all the time. But in this technique, after the pause, you're actually noticing that you're breathing. You're noticing the in and the out of the breath. Maybe you're actually able to lengthen and soften the breathing. Maybe you can use your breathing to help ground or calm you down. Then what we can do is we can actually rewind. We can rewind the incident, the event, the tension, the thing we weren't accepting, and we can replay it in our minds. So we often think when we see something that it is a certain way. We often think that an event happened a certain way, but it's not actually true that we've seen it from all the angles. And so by rewinding it allows us to see it from potentially a new angle. And then from that new angle, we can notice, we can actually start seeing a wider perspective, a different view of what actually is happening. Right? Did he actually say that? Did she actually say that? Right? Is this actually really that bad? Is this actually really going to work out? By noticing gives us space. And that space can actually allow us to reframe. We can actually now take the thing that we've seen from a different angle and reframe it in a more positive, more meaningful way that benefits us. And at that point, we can respond. So there's a difference between reacting and responding. Right? So reacting is what happens without pausing, without breathing, without rewinding. It's when you just naturally react. We are wired as a species to react to dangers, to threats. And even though I might have taken 30 seconds to describe these words, the more and more you do it, it will become natural. It won't even feel like you're pausing or you're breathing or you're rewinding. It will just happen naturally. So I encourage everyone to find a way to accept the change by just finding a place where you can pause. It doesn't have to be a physical place like a balcony, but it just has to be a state of mind where you are pausing. And this is what's called witness consciousness. It's being a witness to what happened and being more conscious and aware to what is happening. So number 3 is to be transparent. So there's a lot of people that might be looking up to you. You might not realize it, but there might be people in your companies, communities, friends, families that are looking up to you. And when they're looking up to you, they're looking for transparency because they too are dealing with their own uncertainty. They too are dealing with their own fears and worries and doubts. So the more transparent you are, the more you can help them with their own certainty. So one way of doing that is by being present. So if we look at the triangle, the outer edges, there's 3 roles or 3 characters in the drama triangle. Every story, every film, every company, and maybe even every family has a hero, a victim, and a villain. Maybe you yourself have played all 3 of these characters of a hero, a victim, and a villain. Each of these voices represent what the hero says, or the victim says, or the villain says. So a hero's voice is, I can help, I can do this. Whereas a victim's voice is, it's hard, there's nothing I can do. And a villain's voice is, you're wrong, you're to blame. So a layer deeper, each of these characters wants a different thing. So a hero wants to be valued, whereas a victim wants security, and a villain wants to dominate. So in transparency, what's important is for you to, 1, be transparent with yourself of what voice are you using. Are you looking to be the hero or the victim or the villain? Or is there a way you can be present? Is there a way that you can be in the center and focus on learning and connection and relationship. So the more in the center you are, the more you can help people feel that trust and that connection, and the more you can help pull them into their own centers. So number 4 is to set reasonable expectations. The expectations of the old world, let's call that before Corona or before COVID, BC, and the era that we're living in now, which is after COVID or after Corona, expectations are different. So unreasonable expectations, when we expect something to happen, put stress on our mind and our brains. When we have unreasonable expectations, that leads to stress, whether it's about building your company to 10 people, to 100 people, to 1,000, to a unicorn status, whether it's getting X euros, millions of euros worth of revenue, right? It's that unreasonable expectation can be stress. And so what's happening in the stress in a system of our brain is it's attacking the 3 layers. So at the red part, the ancient survival brain, when we declare an unreasonable expectation, we're actually saying my safety, my survival depends on this unreasonable expectation. I can only survive if I hire 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. I can only survive if I get this many sales. So that red part of our brain was useful when we were fighting in our ancient times, maybe dinosaurs, maybe other animals. The next layer is the emotional. That's when we're looking for some connection, and it's looking for the feelings connected with the emotion. But as we've evolved as a species, we have developed the green part, the executive side of our brain, the front brain, and that's about learning. That's where the curiosity and love that we mentioned earlier comes in. That's where your strengths as humans can really help you set a reasonable expectation that's achievable, and then move on to the next big reasonable expectation, and to the next, and to the next. And it's not necessarily about the goals, it's more about what am I learning from this? How can I become more resilient? How can I become a better leader, a better human? So number 5 is being realistic and optimistic. A lot of people ask me, well, how can I be both? Like, can I just pick one? Can I just be realistic or just optimistic? And it's important to be both so that you're more believable. There's vulnerability in being realistic, but there's hope in the optimism. So a question to ask yourself is, what is best and who is best for your business going forward? Some of the key words is what is, as in what is the thing that you should be doing that's best for your business, and who is or who are best for your business. Key word again is going forward, right? Looking at the past doesn't necessarily help. We have to be going forward, what is and who is best. So if that means laying off people, which many companies have had to do, if it means holding, hiring, and freezing headcount, might have to be done. So there's also, beyond letting people go, is thinking about how do you be realistic and optimistic with those that remain, right? We've said goodbye maybe to people on our team, but maybe we're now left with a reduced team of 30, 40%, is thinking about how do I be realistic and optimistic with them? Effectively, those that remain, those that stay in your company, they're dealing with distractions. First is guilt. And that guilt is, why did I survive? Right? How did I get chosen to survive and my friend and my colleague didn't? So there might be some guilt there. Secondly, questions surface around, will I be next? When the CEO lays off more people, will I be next? And the third is, wow, we're down to 30, 40%. Will we as a company even survive? So it's important as founders, as leaders, to address these concerns, these distractions, in a realistic and optimistic way, right? They can handle the truth. They're the best people that you chose to keep. They can handle the reality. But they also need that optimism that there is a future, that there is a plan. Even if that plan changes, there is a plan. So here are some things you can do to help them move forward. Right? So those that have remained in your company, how do we help them move forward? And it's understanding that what I've observed, every human needs 6 things. And it starts with stability. So you as a leader, CEO, founder, can actually help them feel stable, right? With whatever stability you can offer them, make sure they fully embrace that stability. The second is, people want variety. I'm hearing a lot of people are feeling a little bored, stuck being home, right? It's been the same now for a few weeks, months. How do you offer up some variety in who they work with, what they work on, how they work? How do you make it more interesting and appealing? The third is making them feel important. This whole era has been a very humbling experience for everyone, right? And so how do you actually help build that up by making them feel important, that their work is important, their role is important, and they're important to you and the company? There's actually a break here in the 3. So the first 3 I call as kind of earthly needs. And beyond this takes us a little away from being on earth. And it's that word again, love, right? So every human wants to be loved, to feel safe and loved, but also every human wants to love. So find ways that people can feel safe and loved. A little beyond that is growth. Every human wants to grow. Whether it's physically moving from Amsterdam, London, Lisbon, Berlin, whether it's actually learning new subjects, whether it's actually expanding their experience, expanding their horizon, every human wants to feel like they are growing. So how do you create a growth path for all of the people in your company? And lastly, every human wants to contribute. Every single human has an idea or a concept or a question of why they exist, what they're here to do, what is success in their world. And how do you get to understand that? And how do you tie that into your company? How do you make why your employees feel like they contribute in the world is connected to their work at your company? Right? So understanding where people are is a responsibility of leaders, right? Knowing where people are on this, and then secondly, helping them get what they need and moving them up. So let me know if we want to take another break for questions, otherwise I can keep going. And the sixth one is recognizing no one person has the answers. So we'll take questions in a bit after this one. So recognizing no one person has the answers is because this has never been done before, we can't necessarily rely on governments and leaders in business and the world to solve this for us. But it's actually understanding that that one answer that we're all looking for can come from anyone. And so what that means is knowing that we can't expect the answers to come from the traditional channels is being open to listening. And what I mean by being open to listening is all of your employees, family members, loved ones have a voice, have a potential solution, how we can all improve this thing that we're in. So it requires active listening. And active listening, in fact, if we are listening, non-active listening, when we actually don't listen, people disengage, disconnect, check out 40% of the time. So if you're not listening, even though it feels like a conversation, if you're not listening, people will disconnect 40% of the time, so you will miss key information. If you're actually negative in your listening, right? If you're not just disconnected, but you're negative in your response, they're likely to disconnect 22% of the time. However, if you're active and positive in your listening, they're 99% more likely to stay engaged. And through that engagement, through your conversation, your dialogue with another, any other, we can all find solutions to this thing in different capacities. So I'll practice some active listening while Magda hopefully shares some questions.
So first question is about this, as you said, common behavior during the crisis that leaders overmanage and underlead. So can you give us please some of the examples when those leaders are overmanaging and underleading?
Yeah, so overmanaging, I'm just trying to understand where it comes from. And the root of it is possibly a panic, a fear, a worry, right? It's coming from the reptilian part of our brain. It's the survival part of our brain. So yes, this crisis is going on. And that panic that comes up from leadership is, we still need to get all this done, right? We need to get even more done, or this should have been done. And so what that does is it creates a lot of extra busy work in the panic of just getting and producing stuff. Secondly, as leaders themselves haven't taken the break or the time out to identify what matters most for them, there's a lot of projection. There's a lot of displaying what's going on in their own mind that hasn't been sorted out onto others. And lastly, there's a piece of leaders that want to maintain their position as leaders and might have the hero voice of, we can do this, I can do this. And they're creating more unnecessary involvement or oversight. They're getting their hands too deep into the details as a way of saying, I'm a hero, I can help. So over-managing can often be dangerous in a crisis. And leadership means understanding, hey, we're dealing with an obstacle, but there's an obstacle after this obstacle and one after that obstacle. And we will get through those, but we don't know how, but we have to stay positive, realistic, optimistic, and we just got to keep battling together through those, right? So a leader just needs to understand that these are just obstacles and that together we're going to get through those.
Thank you. So we have a question from Thomas. Do you see a biographical influence on how people are reacting to the current situation?
Could you try to help me understand the word biographical?
It could be maybe both geographical or maybe backgrounds of people, whether it has any influence on how founders react to the situation based on your talks with founders from different regions.
Yeah, so there's definitely a geographical difference for sure. And that geographical difference is, so if we think about those of us that are in Europe or America, this is probably the first time we've been experienced or exposed to a virus like this. But parts of Asia have gone through their own historical viruses. And so they're more used to understanding the impacts, what they need to do, how do they adapt, how do they deal, how do they support their friends, families, and teams. So even if they've just had one round, let's say SARS before us, they're that much more familiar that they can deal with it better than we can. So yes, there are geographical differences, but I think the key difference is really individual mindset. I think the individual that sits in that bucket of, I'm an entrepreneur, I can be curious, I can solve problems, I want to solve problems. This is just a really big problem that I want to be part of solving. So it's a can-do attitude. It really is a mindset and an attitude of, I can and I want to, right? So I have enough of the skills and I have enough of the will or enough of the motivation. And I think that could be universal. It's not a geography.
Sure. But on the other hand, what do you think about actually sharing with the teams our vulnerability? So not only saying, yes, I can, but also saying that we are struggling.
Yeah. So vulnerability, Magda, is a super valuable human quality. And so what happens is the more vulnerability we show, the more human we are. And so others, when they're listening to you being a human, they feel more connected, they feel more trustworthy or trusted of you. There's an authenticity by being vulnerable. So it's less about should I be vulnerable or not. I think the real decision is how much is enough. How vulnerable should I be to, one, get connection and that deeper relationship with my team, but how much is too much? And so I would say focus on actually getting close to the line for now. Focus on being vulnerable and getting close to the line of enough. And you'll know when you're getting too far to beyond the line.
Thank you. So we have a question from Jorge. We see lately media adapting to the new normal, but the new normal is heavily influenced by the current situation that we know is temporary. So what do you think the new normal will be once this is over?
So there's when was normal? Tell me the date when normal was. I think there's never actually been a normal, right? So we're led to believe that everything before this was one big normal, but it was always changing. So there's always going to be new normals. We're constantly evolving. Things are always changing. Even if we just think about the technology world, the devices that we're watching this on didn't exist 20 years ago, 10 years ago, right? So there was never a normal. So I think what we're doing is we're creating an illusion of what was normal, and we're making it harder for us to move on because we're more and more attached to this fake normal of a world that we lived in. It's always been changing and it always will.
Thanks. So again, a question about What is certain and what is uncertain about ourselves? As a leaders, should we continuously be questioning the things we think that are certain? I mean, accepting that something uncertain might block our perception to adapt our mindset of looking at the problem from a different angle. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's a gift that we as a species of humans, as intelligent beings, have the ability to ask that question again and again and again. What is certain? What is uncertain? Right? Some of the greatest philosophers, some of the greatest minds on the planet, some of the greatest artists, musicians, writers have all contemplated that question of what is certain, what is uncertain. So the beautiful thing about this is there is no answer. And the second beautiful thing about this is you get to decide when you've got enough of an answer for yourself. And it might not apply to others, but as long as you have that freedom to ask yourself that question and get to your own answer, I think we all win that way.
Right. So another challenging question to answer is, how do we know what's reasonable after the COVID?
Yeah, so I think we have to stay focused on now. And one, we don't know when after is, right? There isn't a date when it's ended. I think, unfortunately, historically, we can point to end dates of wars and say that war ended on this date, but we won't actually have a date for this one. So one, we don't know when the after is. Secondly, there won't be a clean date when we say this is now after. So it's going to be living in the gray zone. There's a lot of us want black and white, like my slides. Make it simple, right? Just to read black and white. Life is black and white, binary, yes or no. But we're going to have to all get used to dealing with gray. And so the shades of gray include knowing that we don't know when after COVID is. We don't know what life will look like after. But what we can do is, when we don't know what technology, government, society will look like, we can get more and more grounded in who we are, how my mind works, how I make decisions, my likes, my dislikes, right? The more solid you are in you, the most stable thing around you is you. The more trained and ready you are to deal with whatever that period after is. So I wouldn't focus on the reasonable expectations after. I would focus on strengthening yourself to deal with whatever comes after.
Thanks. So let's take one last question for now, and it's actually the topic of active listening. How do you retain attention of people you are speaking to? Especially what if you're going on a bit and you're getting a little bit boring? How do you make sure that people will still actively listening to you?
So if you know you've become boring, then you probably know that they are finding it boring. So it has to start with yourself. And how do you make sure you're connecting with the other, with the content you want to share and you feel that they want to know, right? How do you make the content appealing? How do you then make the delivery of your content appealing? But also, how do you almost use this non-measurable thing of energy? How do you make sure that the energy that you're conveying has enough enthusiasm and passion that keeps them engaged? So look back at your content and make sure you've reduced it to the bullet points that need to be said from your side, but also reduced it down to what they need to hear. Second is make sure that the style and the way that you're delivering the content is engaging. And then thirdly is just observing the energy, like making sure that you're using the energy, enthusiasm to engage them.
And what if, on the other hand, you are in the team of a leader that is talking a lot and might be a little bit boring? How can we give them feedback so that they can improve?
So giving feedback to leaders, CEOs, execs is hard. So one, if a leader asks for feedback, is very different. If a leader doesn't want feedback, then it's very different. But if a leader is sort of in the middle where you don't know whether they want it or don't want it, you almost have to do it delicately, right? So if a leader asks for feedback, it's easier. Do it in a way that he or she feels good about the feedback you're giving. If a leader doesn't want feedback, then you're kind of risking the relationship by giving feedback. So I wouldn't recommend doing it. If they're in the middle, what I would do is I would think of like best in class case studies. I would find a way to thank them for their presentation, their delivery. And I would say, I'm also learning about how to deliver great content. And I heard these 2 techniques that I found useful, right? So you're gently introducing the technique that you use or you admire to the leader without making it about them. And let's hope that they grab it and embrace it.
Thank you. So let's move on with the presentation and we'll keep the rest of the questions till the end.
Okay, thanks, Magda. So number 7 is my favorite and should be our easiest, and that is experiment with everything. As founders, as leaders, as entrepreneurs, you chose to leave a job, you chose to leave a college or university, you chose to start something, you chose to experiment. So all of you are masters, are experts at experimenting. But you apply that with everything. So as entrepreneurs, you've already demonstrated self-motivation, discipline, creativity, risk-taking, and resiliency, right? As entrepreneurs, by the fact that you're on this Google for Startups event, means you're entrepreneurs, means you've got these qualities. But how do you make sure every day you're flexing those muscles to become stronger and better? How do you make sure every day you're being more creative, more resilient, taking more risk, right? Being self-disciplined, being self-motivated. How do you make sure you use your ability as entrepreneurs for everything? Right? This is where the fun is. This is how we solve the crisis, by having each of you in different cities, different countries, being entrepreneurs. So number 8 is prioritize ruthlessly. And while the word ruthless sounds a little ruthless, it's supposed to be. So we've all got thousands of things to do: email, Slack messages, stuff, meetings, Zooms, Google Hangouts. And there's things that we should do and there's things that we shouldn't do, right? So knowing as things hit your calendar, hit your desk, hit your inbox, do I do it or don't I do it? So the 3 do's are easy. I always tell CEOs, founders, you should be doing the strategy and the vision. You as a leader should know the strategy and the vision. Number 2, you as a leader should know how revenue could come in, whether it's fundraising, whether it's selling. And the 3rd is you as a leader should know how to inspire, hire, develop great people. So it's the vision, the money, and the people. That has to be in your do side. On your don't do side, there's actually 3 areas. There's delegating, dumping, and delaying. During this current era crisis where others are also overwhelmed, uncertain, I'm actually going to suggest not focusing too much on delegating, right? Because that might lead into the over-management. I'm going to suggest focus on dumping and delaying. So think about what can just be dumped, trashed, thrown out, doesn't need to be dealt with, isn't important, isn't going to keep our company alive. Even if it felt important 3 months ago, ask yourself, is this worth keeping, or do I dump it? Maybe there's a delay. Maybe there's a hope that that so-called new normal comes in the summer and that we can delay things till then. Sure, keep things in the delay bucket, but the focus has to be on the do's. And the more you clean up your calendar, your agendas, your schedules, your diaries, your inboxes, the more you get out the stuff that you shouldn't do, the more you can focus on the do. And the same for your teams as well. So number 9 is taking care of what matters most. As I'm onboarding CEOs to take them through a coaching process, one of the first questions I ask is, what do you care most about? Hey, Mr. and Mrs. CEO, what do you care most about? And I typically get a quick answer, but then I push them and I say, well, how do you care about the thing you care about most? Right? Like, please tell me how you care about the thing you care about most. And what happens is some people might have 2 or 3 ideas of how they take care of that thing. Some people are more fluent. They have 10, 12 ideas. The more fluent they are, the more convinced I am that they are caring about the thing they care about most. Ask a third question, which is, how else can you care about the thing you care about most? Because truly, if every human knows what they care about most, they should be allocating more time, energy, resources to know how else they can care about it. Otherwise, it's just a word. It's just a thing. So some ways of looking at this is asking yourself what matters most. It could be improving my health. It could be improving my family's life. It could be improving my business, or it could be a whole range of different things. We want to make sure you get to yes. We definitely don't want to do the no's, but anything in between that's in the gray area, that's a maybe, I think of that as a no, right? Does this improve my health? Maybe is a no. Does this improve my family's life? Yes, I'm going to do it. Does this improve my business? Yes, I'm going to do it. Right? So focus on what matters most. So the last one, the 10th one, is redefining what it means to be human. We don't know, right? We don't know what evolutionary moment we're contributing towards. But what we do know is each of you gets to redefine what it means to be human, what it means to be home, what it means to be not able to move through places and places, what it means to be reflecting on how do I survive, how does my business survive, how do I communicate, how do I motivate. We're getting a fresh opportunity to redefine what it means to be human. Right? There was never a period where we could point to and saying that was the normal era of humans. There was never an era we could point to and say that was when humans were humans. So we get to define what it means to be human. And from that definition of a human, we can define what type of leaders we want to be. And from that definition of what type of leader we want to be, we get to build the companies we want to be. But they have to be linked. And it has to start from this number 10. So, like I said at the beginning of the list, focus on one. Don't feel like it's important to take all. Just take what one adjustment you can do for yourself. So on the topic of redefining what it means to be human, there have been many examples of humans searching for a new meaning. And one famous human, Viktor Frankl, as a neurologist, psychologist, and Holocaust survivor, found a way to define his own humanity. And that's finding a space between the stimulus and response, and knowing that within that space is his freedom to respond, right? Even though this human probably went through more hardships than we're going through, he found an opportunity to be reflective and redefine what it means to be human for him, his freedom. Another human, known as prisoner number 1947662, also known as Nelson Mandela, 27 years contained in a cell. I'm pretty sure, without knowing where everyone is in their cities, I'm pretty sure we all have more space than he did. And for 27 years, trapped in that space, he read a poem. And one of the lines from that poem was, being a master of his own fate and being the captain of his own soul. So I share these as moments to believe that if other humans in possibly worse conditions than what we're experiencing were able to redefine what their own humanity was, then we too have that opportunity. Because we know there is a world of stress, emotions, and thoughts. Because we know that we've had to live, deal, work with these. The simplest way to think about this is watching your thoughts. Our thoughts become actions. Our actions become habits. And our habits become our destiny. So even if we just found a way to notice, watch our thoughts, right? Our thoughts are actually leaving impressions on our minds and brains. So we can actually rewire our minds and brains rather than saying, this is going to fail, we're going to lose, right? This is too hard, this can't be done. Maybe we can use the same amount of words and say, well, this can be done. We can win. There is a way out, right? We can do this, right? So it's a simple shift in changing the words and changing the thoughts to ultimately changing actions, habits, and hopefully destiny. So a way to think about managing your thoughts is to mind your mind. So our minds play massive tricks on us all the times. We're constantly stacking memories over memories over memories over memories of an event that might have happened 20 years ago. And yet the stacking of the memories has totally diluted the story of what really happened. Not only are we doing that over a 20, 30, 40-year span, we're doing that in microseconds, in micro moments. Let's see if you can read this. So I've read that many times, and there's still a couple of words I mess up. And there's another one. So this one I get down every single time. It's really easy for me to read. So what our mind's doing, and I'm assuming everyone was able to read it, what our mind's doing is it's filling in the gaps, right? If we take that first word, S1M1, our mind has quickly scanned and made an assumption, filled in the gap of what it thinks it should be. Now, some of the aliens that one day land on our planet will say, wow, that's a gift that humans have, the ability to just complete a word without even seeing the full word. But it's also a trap, right? Because if we take the second sentence, the second line, the first word, number 7H15, right? I read that word as this, but what if 7H15 was the vaccine to the virus and I missed it? What if that code was significant to our survival and I missed it? So we want to find a way to mind our mind and really find a way to create gaps, create pauses to understand, are we actually taking in what's really happening? Is this really happening? Is this word really the word I'm meant to read? Is this person really behaving the way I'm saying they're behaving? Is this candidate I'm trying to hire really the candidate I want to hire? Is this crisis really a crisis with a capital C? So it's really important to know that your brains, your minds are powerful to fill in things, but only let it fill in what you want it to fill in, right? Know when it's filled in to help and know when it's filled to get in the way. So last couple of slides. So ultimately, we're all in this together. And we have to view this as an opportunity. So the word crisis